I was scrolling through the newsfeed this morning, and it really struck me how different the headlines feel depending on where they're coming from.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You look at the US, and it's always, another tech breakthrough in Silicon Valley or a huge stock market rally.
Yeah.
Then you look at China, and it's these colossal infrastructure projects finishing way ahead of schedule.
Right. It's all speed and scale. That is
Yeah.
the dominant narrative we always hear.
Exactly. But then you get to the news from Europe, and
Right.
it's a meeting, or it's a debate about a future meeting,
Or
or
a committee being formed.
a committee forming to discuss a regulation for a technology that hasn't even fully launched yet. It just feels so incredibly different.
It does.
Oh.
And that feeling often leads to a very specific conclusion for most people. When we look at the global stage, we tend to treat it like a track meet.
Right.
You've got the United States sprinting ahead with capital and innovation. You've got China sprinting with manufacturing and state control.
And then there's the EU, who looks like the guy who stopped mid-race to argue with the ref about whether his running shoes are, I don't know, ethically sourced.
That's a perfect way to put it. That is the common perception. In that race metaphor, the EU always looks like it's lagging, or worse, just failing. It feels bureaucratic, sluggish, kind of unable to decide anything while the world moves at light speed.
Right. The story is that Europe is just a slower, weaker version of the superpowers. But we've got a whole stack of research here today, specifically this global operating architecture analysis, the GOA.
Mm-hmm.
And it suggests we're looking at this completely wrong. I mean, the premise here is pretty wild. What if that's slowness? What if it isn't a bug? What if it's a feature?
That is the hook. We're going to challenge that whole idea that the EU is incompetent and explore this possibility that it's actually running a completely different operating system for governance.
So, not a failed sprinter, but someone playing a totally different sport.
Exactly. We aren't here to judge if the EU is good or bad.
Yeah.
Our mission is to analyze the structure of slowness. We're going to look at how these different regions are running, basically incompatible software.
And how the EU functions as a massive friction coefficient in a world obsessed with speed.
Precisely.
Friction coefficient. I love that term. It sounds like physics, but for geopolitics. So let's dive into these sources, GOA-14.3 and GOA-13. To understand Europe's OS, we first have to map out what it's being compared to. The sources lay out this map of asymmetry.
Right, and this is crucial context. You can't understand the EU's slowness without first understanding the, let's call it the dangerous speed of the others. The world is breaking, but it's breaking differently everywhere.
Okay, so let's start in the East. The GOA analysis describes the Chinese model as runaway internal competition. Now, that's interesting because we usually hear about China as this monolith, right? Everyone marching in step.
We do, but this suggests it's actually hyper-competitive internally.
In what way?
The analysis describes the system as being designed like a shark. It has to keep moving to breathe. It's not just about hitting economic growth targets. It's a survival mechanism for the party and the entire bureaucracy.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
Unbelievably high. Imagine a marathon where stopping doesn't just mean you lose. It means you're, removed from the track entirely. For local officials, for the internal systems in China, constant motion, constant building, constant political maneuvering, it's all just to survive the internal purge mechanisms.
That paints a really intense picture. It's a pressure cooker.
It is. If you stop, debt bubbles could burst, or you lose your political standing. So its mode of failure is a rapid, rigid break. The whole structure goes full speed until it just snaps. It needs velocity to hold together.
Okay, so China is running because it's terrified of what happens if it stops. Now let's look at the United States. The sources call this runaway market optimization. As an American, I hear optimization, and I think, yeah, that's good. We want to optimize everything.
We usually do. But the source material asks a really critical question. What are you optimizing for? In the U.S. operating system, the source code is basically written to optimize for capital efficiency, for stock prices, for growth above all else.
And the argument here is that this has gone so far, it's actually eating the foundations of the house.
That's a great way to put it. The GOA analysis uses housing as its prime example. In a stable society, housing is shelter. It's a place for a family. But when you optimize it purely for the market, housing transforms into a financial asset.
Right. It becomes a speculative instrument first and a home second.
Exactly. And when that happens, you start to see prices totally decouple from wages. The market is working perfectly for the investor. It's optimized, but it's completely failing the actual resident.
Which means the system becomes too fast for human needs because it's chasing those immediate returns. It starts to commoditize the entire social fabric, education, healthcare, you name it.
So if we simplify that map, you have the China, jeopardizing stability for control. You have the U.S. jeopardizing stability for market speed. Both are what you could call accelerationist models. They're willing to break things just to go faster.
Which brings us, finally, to the European Union. If the US and China are flooring the gas pedal, the EU is apparently standing on the brakes with both feet. The sources call it overbraking.
It's the polar opposite. The EU is structurally designed not to move until it has consensus. Where the others sacrifice stability for speed, the EU will sacrifice all speed to maintain stability, norms, and legitimacy.
But is that a conscious design choice, or is the computer just frozen? Because honestly, to an outsider, it really can look like paralysis.
It's not frozen, it's a safety mechanism.
Yeah.
But to get why it works that way, we have to define what the EU actually is. And this is the part of the research that really made it all click for me. The EU isn't a nation state.
I mean, we know it's a union of countries, but it acts like one in a lot of ways. It has a flag, an anthem.
It has all the symbols, sure, but it lacks the hardware. Think about the basic tools a nation state uses. If the U.S. government wants something to happen, it has two huge levers. One, the U.S. Treasury. It can just print money.
The unlimited cash cheat code.
Basically. And two, the U.S. military. The monopoly on violence. It can force compliance. The EU has neither. It doesn't have a single fiscal sovereign that can just print euros to solve a crisis without begging for permission from 27 different countries.
And it certainly doesn't have an EU army to march in and force a country to behave.
So if you can't force people with guns, and you can't just buy them off with unlimited federal cash, how do you rule? How do you get 27 countries to move in the same direction?
You do it with rules.
You rule by rules. You rule by norms, laws, and standards. The sources call this a normative polity.
Normative polity. Okay, that sounds a little academic. Let's unpack that.
It just means the fuel of the system isn't capital, like the U.S., or coercion, like China. Its fuel is legitimacy. Every single decision has to be debated, agreed upon, and codified so that everyone buys in voluntarily.
That sounds exhausting.
It is exhausting. That's exactly why it's so slow, but it's also why it's so durable. Because once a rule is made, it's not some decree from a dictator. It's a consensus reality.
You know, I came up with an analogy for this. Tell me if this tracks. The U.S. is like a company trying to build the fastest, craziest Formula One car possible.
Right.
They want to break the land speed record. The EU, on the other hand, isn't trying to build a car at all. The EU is the guy building the traffic lights, the crash test dummies, and writing the emission standards.
That is a perfect analogy. It's absolutely perfect. The EU doesn't want to drive the market. It wants to build the road, and more importantly, the rules of the road.
So the whole game changes. It's not who wins. It's what are you even allowed to do on this track?
Precisely. And this leads to what the sources call allowable conditions. The U.S. operating system asks, can we do it? If the tech exists and it makes money, the answer is almost always yes. The EU operating system asks, should we allow this?
And we see this with things like GDPR for data privacy or the new AI Act.
Exactly. And notice the pattern. These regulations don't help Europe build new tech giants. Europe isn't producing the next Google or Alibaba. But these regulations determine how Google and Alibaba are allowed to behave inside its borders.
Which brings us back to that core concept you mentioned at the top, the friction coefficient. Because usually friction is the enemy, right? We want frictionless everything.
It is the only source of power available to a normative polity. If you can't out-innovate them and you can't outspend them, you regulate the environment they have to operate in. And here's the genius part. It's not just local. It's what's known as the Brussels effect.
The Brussels effect. Right, I've heard this term. It's the idea that EU rules somehow go viral.
In a way. Just think about the sheer size of the European market. It's hundreds of millions of wealthy consumers. You can't be a global company and just ignore them.
Of course not. If Apple wants to be Apple, they have to sell in France and Germany.
Exactly. So Brussels passes a law about, say, privacy standards for websites, or the most famous one, USB-C charging ports on phones.
Ah, the death of the lightning cable.
RIP. But think about the economics for a company like Apple. Is it cheaper to build two different iPhones, one with USB-C for Europe, one with Lightning for the US, and manage two separate supply chains?
No way. That's a logistical nightmare. You just fold. You make the European standard your global standard.
And that is the friction coefficient at work. The weak power binds the strong power. The EU effectively exports its norms back to America. Apple changes its chargers worldwide because of a decision made in a committee room in Brussels.
It acts as a speed bump that forces the Ferrari to drive like a Volvo.
That's it.
It's just wild when you think about it. We think power comes from a gun or a massive GDP number, but this is power coming from bureaucracy.
It's power coming from market access that's conditioned on ethics. And the sources go even deeper. They talk about something called the world membrane.
Okay, now we're getting abstract world membrane. What does the analysis mean by that?
It's a psychological concept in the GOA framework. The world membrane is the layer of assumptions that we all operate under, the things we just believe are true without even questioning them.
Like growth is always good or more technology means progress.
Exactly. The U.S. operating system relies on the assumption that efficiency is good and markets are neutral. The belief is that if a market produces a result, a monopoly, a gig economy, that's just the truth. It's the most efficient outcome, so it must be right.
But the EU model fundamentally challenges that, doesn't it?
It injects a virus right into that assumption. The EU model says, hold on, efficiency is only good if it is ethical. It says that markets aren't these neutral forces of nature. They're dangerous beasts that need to be caged, or at least leashed.
So they're really trying to rewrite the source code of global capitalism. They're saying markets aren't the masters, they're just tools that have to serve society.
And that is a profound, profound shift. It's why the EU seems so annoying to American CEOs. It's not just red tape, it's a philosophical attack on their core belief system. The EU is trying to be a civilizing mechanism against the raw force of the market.
Okay, I'm with you. The EU is the wise elder making sure the teenagers don't crash the car. It sounds noble, but hey, let's play devil's advocate. The sources also highlight a major risk. If you're always the brake, don't you eventually just stop?
This is the danger of what the sources call shear.
Shear, like wind shear.
Very similar concept. It's about the difference in velocity. Imagine the two tectonic plates moving past each other. One is moving at 1,000 miles an hour, the other is moving at 1 inch a year. What happens at the boundary?
An earthquake. It tears apart.
Exactly. The fast world tech, AI, crypto, high-frequency finance, modern warfare, it all operates in milliseconds to days. The EUOS, bureaucracy, consensus, parliamentary debate, it operates in years to decades.
And that gap is getting wider every single day. I mean, just look at AI. New models come out. The world changes overnight. The EU's AI Act took, what, 3 or 4 years to draft?
And by the time it's fully implemented, the technology will be 5 generations ahead.
Yeah.
This is what creates what the analysis calls calcification. The system hardens.
Calcification,
Yeah.
like your arteries hardening.
Yes. The regulations arrive too late to matter. Or they become what you'd call performative. They look like rules, you sign the papers, you check the boxes, but the reality on the ground has already completely bypassed them. The fast world just flows around the blockage.
That's a scary thought. The government passes a law, pats itself on the back for being ethical, and the tech companies just shrug and go, oh, that applied to version 3.0. We're on version 6.0 now.
Precisely. And this leads to massive internal frustration. The population looks at its government and feels like it's paralyzed. When a real crisis hits, a migration wave, a war on the border, that consensus mechanism takes way too long to boot up.
Right. You can't hold a committee meeting when there are tanks rolling across the border.
And that is the core structural vulnerability. The U.S. adapts through chaos. It breaks things and rebuilds fast. China adapts through command. The party says jump. Everyone jumps. The EU, it risks just becoming irrelevant.
So the risk isn't that the EU collapses. The risk is that it becomes a museum. A very nice, safe, well-regulated museum that doesn't matter anymore because real history is being made outside its walls.
A museum where the rules are perfect, but the game is being played somewhere else. If the friction becomes too high, the capital and the innovation might just decide to route around Europe entirely. We're already seeing hints of this, right? Some AI features launch in the U.S. months before Europe.
Well, they don't launch in Europe at all.
Exactly. That is sheer inaction. The plates are pulling apart.
It forces us to ask a really tough question. Is it even possible to have a high-tech, fast-moving society that also values human dignity and consensus above all else? Or do you eventually have to choose one?
I think you do.
That brings us to a really interesting synthesis, then. We started by asking if the EU is failing. And the answer seems to be, it's not failing at its game, but its game might be incompatible with the modern timeline.
It's trying to play a different sport, one that civilizes capitalism. And that's a noble goal. But the asymmetry of survival is brutal.
Let's recap that one last time, because it really frames the whole global picture.
Okay. China faces the risk of breaking from internal pressure. The boiler explodes. The U.S. faces the risk of breaking from social erosion. Society dissolves because everything's for sale. And the EU faces the risk of fading from paralysis. The brakes just lock up and the engine stalls.
It's not a very cheery forecast for any of them. You've got control, markets, and norms. And all three seem to be hitting their structural limits.
Which brings up the most fascinating question of all. If these three big models are all showing signs of failure, what about the fourth player?
You're talking about Japan.
I am. Japan is often, just lumped in with the West, or it's treated as a cautionary tale by economists. But structurally, it is doing something completely different from everyone else.
Yeah, the narrative on Japan is usually stagnant, the lost decades, deflation, an aging population. We usually frame that as a failure.
But look closer. In a world of runaway speed and friction, Japan has endured. It's maintained incredible social cohesion without U.S.-style growth. It's maintained high technology without Chinese-style control. And it doesn't do the aggressive, exportable rulemaking of the EU.
So, is Japan's stagnation actually a strategy? Or at least a different kind of stability?
That is the question for our next deep dive. If it's not control, markets, or norms, what has allowed Japan to endure for so long is avoidance a valid survival strategy.
Is not moving, or at least moving so quietly that no one even notices you, the ultimate survival trait in a chaotic world? That is a fascinating thought to leave everyone with.
I can't wait to unpack that one. The Japan protocol is a whole other rabbit hole.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. It's a lot to process: friction, membranes, calcification, but hopefully the next time you hear about a slow European regulation, you'll see the strategy behind the stillness. We'll see you next time.